Let's pray, shall we? Lord, you are the one that our hearts adore. Thank you that your heart is always for us. Your heart is always to grow us, to love us, to bless us. We don't have to plead with you, Lord, to bless us. Your heart is to do that. But your heart is also to grow us and shape us, to grow us in faith, to grow us in trust. Thank you that we are a lifetime's work, Lord. Thank you. Amen. Thanks, guys. Great choice of songs there. Lovely. So I'm going to talk about, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about Philip today. Now, I bet if I said to you, Philip, one of the disciples, there wouldn't be very much that would come to mind that you could say about him, because he's not one of the most obvious disciples, is he? He's not one of the ones that we hear about an awful lot. And most of what we know of Philip actually comes from John. He's always named in the 12, but Philip on his own and Philip's words and Philip's actions are quite brief and few and far between. We meet Philip early on, actually, in the ministry of Jesus, and I'm just going to read those few verses. John chapter 1 says, where are we? 43. The next day, this is after he has called Andrew and Simon. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. And then Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So after calling Simon and Andrew, Jesus goes after Philip. There is the sense in those words that Jesus particularly sought this man out. He goes back to Galilee with intent, and then he finds Philip and he says, "Follow me." Does that sound like an invitation to you, or does it sound like a command? It could be either, couldn't it? It could be either, and I'm not sure which way I would want to land on that. Follow me. So we know that Philip comes from Bethsaida, as does Simon and Andrew. And the likelihood is he was a fisherman too, grown up with Simon and Andrew. But Philip differs from them in quite a significant way. And that way is that his name is a Greek name. It's not the usual kind of Arabic Hebrew names that might have been found in the area. It's a Greek name. Whether this is relevant to Philip or not, it means lover of horses. I don't know how many horses there would have been in that area, but I suppose the Romans would have had them. But anyway, he is a Jewish man with a Greek name. Interesting. He's definitely a disciple, but he isn't part of the what we've heard from time to time through this series. He's not part of the inner circle. He's not often with Simon, James, and John when they are together with Jesus. So he's not a leader, but he is very definitely a disciple. He's definitely a player in this group of men. And just to say here, this is Philip the apostle. It is not Philip the evangelist, who we find in Acts. You might remember Philip in Acts met the Ethiopian, that's a hard thing to say, the Ethiopian eunuch. But this is not that Philip. This is Philip the apostle. And the fact that Philip has a Greek name actually gives rise to an interesting insight, really, an interesting incident. So a bit further on from our reading today, I'm going to read from John 12, 20 to 22. This is a little bit further on in the John's Gospel, and it says, "Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. 'Sir,' they said, 'we would like to see Jesus.' So Philip went to tell Andrew, and then Andrew and Philip, in turn, told Jesus." It's an interesting little incident, isn't it? So John tells us that Philip was an access point for this group of people that otherwise might not have found their way to him, otherwise might not have had opportunity to actually meet Jesus, who might have struggled to have drawn close in some way. So they talk to Philip because they recognize that his name was a Greek name, and he goes off to talk to Andrew, and together they go to Jesus. And I think that tells us something of the humility of this man, that he goes and checks it out with Andrew, and then he goes with Andrew to tell Jesus. He's content to be the messenger. And I wonder what you have in your life. Philip, in this incident, it was Philip's name. What do you have in your life? Where do you go that you will have a contact with a group of people who otherwise would not have any access to Jesus in some way or another? What's unique to you that will be an answer for somebody else to find Jesus because they can't do it any other way? We need to keep our eyes open, I think. Philip is named in all four Gospels, but as I said at the beginning, the details are all in John. And I don't know about you, I find John such an interesting Gospel because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell us the stories of Jesus mostly in chronological order. And we get where Jesus went, and then he did this, and then he did that, and then he went there, and then he came back, and then he went over there, mostly in chronological order. John is not concerned with the timeline of Jesus' life. He's not concerned with whether the stories are out of order or not. He tells stories, the stories of Jesus, for a different significance. He wants to put together the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, and he chooses the stories to highlight the significance of who Jesus is, not just to tell us what he did. Does that make sense? It's a different look at the life of Jesus. And so therefore, when we read this story in John, it's also in Matthew, when we read this story in John, John wants to tell us something. And actually, probably what John wants us to really see in this is that it's one of the 7 signs of John, but we're not talking about that this morning. This is the opportunity for Jesus to show that he is the bread of life. But that's not part of Philip's story per se. So from our reading today, we learn something of Philip. He might be a fisherman by trade, but he's an analyst by character, isn't he? Isn't he? He's an analyst by character. Perhaps intuitive with numbers, a walking calculator, I don't know. But this man, he did something really quite amazing in a few seconds, because Jesus was teaching, he was talking to his disciples on this mountain. Don't you love it that John tells us there was plenty of grass? Plenty of grass, John says, room for everybody to sit down. And he says to Philip, look, There's such a crowd coming. Where will we buy bread for them? And John, if you read the Gospel of John, John is full of, this is what Jesus really meant to do. You notice that? All these asides. Jesus knew what he was doing. It's okay. This is just to test Philip. So he reassures us, John reassures us that all is going to be well here. Jesus had this in hand, but this was a test for Philip, just in case we miss it. Philip, a local man from Bethsaida, would have known where the bread shops were. It was an obvious thing to ask Philip, where would we get bread for this lot of people? And some of the commentators say that that's probably why Jesus asked Philip. But Andrew and Simon came from the same place. They would have known as well, wouldn't they? He doesn't ask them. This is Philip's moment, Philip's question. And Philip is going to learn something. And it seems that no sooner has Jesus asked the question, where are we going to buy bread for this lot, then Philip had literally made an estimation of the head count. Now that's something in itself. He'd calculated the size of the crowd. He'd worked out how many loaves would be needed for that crowd, just for a mouthful each. He'd multiplied the cost so that he knew how much the whole thing would then cost. And then he'd equated that to salary. So he was able to say to Jesus, it's going to take this long to earn that amount of money to give them a mouthful of bread. Is that what Jesus asked? It's not actually the question Jesus asked, is it? Philip's answer, it'll take more than 6 months. Actually, that version said 8 months, but anyway, it's a long time to buy a mouthful each. Jesus asked where, and Philip says, can't be done. How many times in our lives has Jesus asked us a question and we've gone, can't be done. Can't be done. Interestingly, Jesus hasn't asked Judas, the purse keeper, this question. So it's not about money. He hasn't asked Peter, the impetuous one who would have probably 20 ideas about where to get this amount of bread. He's asked Philip, the analyst. That's my name for him, by the way, the analyst. But the analyst has missed out a significant component of his calculations. He counted heads, mouths, and denarius. He didn't count Jesus in this equation. So his calculations were skewed, very skewed. Philip's analysis detailed, but it's flawed because he's got an essential lens missing from his view. I'm tempted to say he should have gone to Specsavers, but that probably wouldn't. He's clearly a problem solver, and a good one. But Jesus wasn't asking him to solve the problem. And that's the problem, I think, for problem solvers. If you are a problem solver and a good one, we rely on our own capacity to solve the problem, don't we? Don't we? We rely on our own ability to come up with the answer. And we leave out God. So Jesus asked him the question, where will we buy bread? And he tries to solve the problem himself. Can't be done. And he says, the situation is hopeless. Well, it's not quoted, but I think that's probably what he says. The situation is hopeless. A long time ago, I heard the story of shoe manufacturers, and this was, it happened quite a long time ago because it's in the days of telegrams. So actually some of you might not even know what a telegram is. Showing my age here, but anyway. A telegram was a text message sent through the post, in effect. Effectively, this shoe company wanted to market their shoes in a new location. So they sent out a couple of people to another land, and a very poor land, and they asked them to scope out the possibilities of selling shoes in that place and to telegram an answer back. And one sent an answer back that said, "Situation hopeless. No one wears shoes." The other sent a telegram back that said, "Glorious opportunity. No one wears shoes." It's all in the perspective, isn't it? It's all in the perspective. What lens are we looking through when Jesus asks us that question, nudges us with that thing that seems a ridiculous thing to do right now? Neither Philip or Jesus talk about faith in this story, but actually it is the underpinning thing that's going on here. It's the backdrop. Philip wants to solve the problem and can't do it. What might his answer have been instead of the "it can't be done"? What might I have answered? What might you have answered if Jesus had said to you, "Where can we get bread for this lot?" What would you have said? Sorry? Go on. Lord, you know. Over to you. Greg's? What would you say, I wonder? A better answer, I can't say that this would have been my answer, but perhaps a better answer would have been, "I've no idea, but you tell me what you want me to do and I'll go and do it. I can't do it, but you can." And if we don't do that, we make God our God of last resort, don't we? Instead of God of our first thought. So for Philip, God was the last thing that he came to, not his first thought. Faith and trust, they're hard won, aren't they? Easily lost, but hard won. And we only learn, if you meet a new person and begin to develop a friendship, you don't immediately plant all your trust in them and then see what happens, do you? You learn trust by conversation. Are they going to turn up when they say they're going to turn up? Are they going to let me down? And trust builds. Same with faith. I love that faith is, I don't know what you think about faith, what you think faith is, whether faith is something that you have to muster in yourself and kind of boost it somehow in order to do something. Actually, faith is what God deposits in us. The Greek word for faith is pistis, and it means divine persuasion. God puts it in you. It's what we do with it that is the issue. You know those stories in the Gospels where Jesus says, "Your faith has healed you"? Remember those stories? The woman with the issue of blood, Bartimaeus, in his blindness. Your faith has healed you. Does that mean that they were able to muster up the faith in order for God to do what he wanted to do? No. God put his persuasion in them to take a step, to go and find Jesus. That was the step. And then God did the rest. And it's a bit like a muscle. If we exercise it, it grows. John Wimber said that faith was spelled R-I-S-K. We always take a risk when faith is involved, don't we? But God isn't going to ask us to walk on water when actually we haven't done any of that little bits of building of faith beforehand. It wasn't the first thing he ever asked Peter to do, was it? Get out the boat. Peter had lots of opportunities to grow in faith before that big one came along. So in whatever situations you face today, what are you seeing? Are you seeing your limitations, or are you seeing God's opportunities? And what's he asking you to do with it?